Epic fantasy is dying. Publishing houses are seemingly abandoning epic fantasy. Several fantasy adaptations such as Rings of Power and Wheel of Time are tanking. And romantasy such as Fourth Wing and cozy fantasy such as Legends and Latte is getting all the love at the moment. I mean, how did we get to a place where we are reading books such as Lord of the Rings with passages such as "Home is behind, the world ahead, and there are many paths to tread, through shadows to the edge of night, until the stars are all alight," to Fourth Wing with passages such as "Lust and logic never seem to go in hand," or "I'd have to be a masochist to sleep with you, and I can assure you, I am not. Fantasizing about it doesn't count." I mean, Fourth Wing and books like that is not the reason why I'm reading fantasy, and it's a real shame that it feels like traditional publishing is basically abandoning my favorite genre. So today I want to discuss the state of epic fantasy, why publishing seems to be abandoning it, and where I think we are going. Now, I've been wanting to make this video literally for 6 months, and I've kept postponing it until I recently saw Patrick Leo post a really great video about this, so it is finally happening. Thank you, Patrick Leo. Now, it really feels like we have been in the golden age of fantasy for the past 15 years or so. I mean, since the successful adaptation of A Game of Thrones, we have seen a huge increase in popularity for fantasy and seen some incredible changes to the genre. I mean, fantasy has become so much more diverse with the rise of exciting new subgenres such as grimdark, Asian-inspired fantasy, African-inspired fantasy, cozy fantasy, and so on have become much more evolved and popular than ever before. And secondly, we have had a lot of fantasy adaptations in the past years, including The Wheel of Time, House of the Dragon, Dune, Rings of Power, The Sandman, The Witcher, and so on. I mean, it has really felt like fantasy has just been rising and rising in popularity until it suddenly didn't. Now, my mind started to change about this whole topic around a year ago when I was invited to a bloggers brunch at Comic-Con, and I was allowed to have brunch with lots of incredible authors, including Adrian Jankowski, the author of Children of Time, and also the massively long series Shadow of Apt. And he probably doesn't even remember saying this, but he said at this brunch, "I will probably never write such a long series again as Shadow of the Apt." And then he said something along the lines of, publishing houses are not interested in such long series anymore, and that publishing is all about shorter series now, such as trilogies and duologies. Now, you might think I'm a bit alarmist here, but let me ask you this question. When was the last time you saw a publishing house announce an epic fantasy series that is 5 books or longer? I mean, seriously, when? I cannot mention a single series that has been announced in the past years that was marketed as an epic fantasy series that is 5 books or longer. Now, that is only one thing, the fact that publishing houses are kind of abandoning the longer series. But the second thing is that there are so few traditional epic fantasy series or books being published at the moment, especially from debut authors, which is such a big shame. Now, I think it will actually be helpful to read some statements from traditional published authors, because I am certainly not the only one that has noticed that publishing houses are seemingly moving away from epic fantasy. And there are several quotes I want to highlight here. So firstly, we'll start with Wesley Chu, who wrote on Twitter last year. He wrote, "Heard something from a veteran industry professional a few weeks ago that shook me, and I can't stop thinking about it. This is the state of epic fantasy right now. The biggest publisher of epic fantasy in Germany is getting out of epic fantasy business." And he followed it up by stating that he thought the reason for this was due to the romantasy basically taking over the genre. Now, I do not know which publishing house he's referring to here, but if this is true, then this is pretty shocking to hear. And we can see the rise of romantasy having a real impact. I mean, I had quite a weird experience at Golandsfest recently, which is a fantasy book festival that was hosted by one of my favorite publishers, Golands, where they focused on epic fantasy at this convention, but they also had panels focusing on romantasy and cozy fantasy. And while I have nothing against these two subgenres doing well, I think it's pretty obvious that people that read primarily epic fantasy are usually not the same people that read romantasy, for example. I mean, yes, technically epic fantasy and romantasy falls under fantasy, but it feels really weird to group them together because we don't read these books for the same reasons. I mean, if someone comes up to me and states that they are a massive fantasy fan and their favorite book is Fourth Wing, and nothing wrong with having Fourth Wing as your favorite book, but then yes, you are technically a fantasy fan, but I would tell that person that we do not read fantasy for the same reasons at all. Again, just to emphasize, I don't think there's anything wrong with people loving romantasy. I just think that grouping us epic fantasy readers with romantasy readers is just weird. Now, secondly, relating to this topic, Ed McDonald, the author of Blackwing and other fantasy books, he posted on Twitter last year this tweet. One of the lessons I've learned from publishing the last 2 trilogies is, if you want to make a career from writing, don't write series. Selling a 3-book trilogy deal sounds great, especially as a debut, but it can also be a rock around your neck. I've seen the impact on a friend when a book 1 of a series didn't sell strongly, meaning that by book 2 there are very few readers, and book 3 had to be written with all the passion that entails, but was essentially going to have below 100 readers. Devastating. He says, my advice would be to debut authors to write standalone novels. Not even a novel with serious potential, just standalones. Maybe you can keep writing in the same world. Okay, here we basically have a relatively well-known fantasy author encouraging debut authors to stay away from writing longer series, since it can be, as he states it, a rock around your neck. Now, I appreciate this advice, but I also think that no fantasy author would have stated anything like this around 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, things are definitely changing. And then Peter McLean, the author of the War for the Rose Throne series, wrote a long thread about how publishing houses are actively asking authors not to write longer books. Now, this thread is a bit long, but I will read most of it, and thank you to Patrick Leo for bringing this one to my attention. Peter McLean wrote, "This industry is brutal. It is especially brutal at the moment when production costs are off the scale because of global economic events. I had my entire War for the Rose Throne quartet published by JFB at Hachette in the UK, and I was very fortunate there. Ace at Penguin in the US dropped it after the first 2 books. They both earned out in the States and are still making me, and therefore them, money, but that's not enough anymore. Making them money is no longer enough. Absorb the fact. You have to make them a lot of money or you're done. And I guess I didn't quite manage to do that. But here's the thing. I never really had a word count constraint before. I think Prince of Crowns published at around 145,000 words. A George R. Martin or Robert Jordan book is at least twice, if not 3 times that. My new contract, glad of it though I am, has a hard 100,000 word cap on it. That's how much of a constraint production costs are now. I think unless you're already a megastar, the days of big fat fantasy are done. Lean and mean seems to be the way forward, like the genre was back in the 60s and 70s. And the crazy thing here is that Mike Shackle and E.L. Lamb both commented stating that they had both been told by their publishing house to not write anything longer than 130,000 words. What? I mean, this is insane to me. I mean, yes, I do understand that profits are important, of course they are, but how can you ask someone to write a fantasy and then simultaneously ask them to limit their word count 100,000 words? I mean, for example, The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson is 214,000 words, so that's basically almost 100,000 words more than what publishing houses are asking authors to limit themselves to at the moment. Just imagine if Sanderson was told to remove 200 pages of The Final Empire, then The Final Empire would certainly not be the same book anymore. And that is not even to mention that many of the greatest books in this genre, for example, the Stormlight Archive books, most of those books are like 400,000 words. There's just something really weird about asking an author to limit themselves because a lot of stories need to have that longer word count. I mean, imagine asking someone to create an adaptation of, I don't know, the Lord of the Rings movies and telling them that they can maximum have 1 hour for each book. I mean, there's just no way you could do that justice, and actually it would make the whole adaptation so much worse. So I'm not sure what you think about this, but asking authors to limit themselves to such a low word count in this genre just seems to be almost morally wrong in my opinion. Now, there's one thing here in this whole discussion that I literally do not understand as well. I mean, if profit was all that matter to publishing houses, then please someone explain to me how so many authors are making a huge living writing traditional epic fantasy in the self-published sphere. Now don't get me wrong, I know that most authors, probably 99% of authors in the indie community, do not sell many books, but let me just mention some that really do. For example, Philip C. Cranetrell, the author of the Echo Saga, has sold close to 1 million books, and he's writing traditional fantasy. And then we have Ryan Cahill, who's writing traditional epic fantasy as well, and he has sold like 300,000 books in the past 2-3 years. And then we have Will White, the author of the Cradle, writing progression fantasy, and he has literally sold millions and millions of books. And then we have Wraithmark, that is doing a fantastic job at promoting and publishing epic fantasy. Now whenever someone tells me that there's no money in epic fantasy in 2024, then I just want to tell them that it's a lie, because many authors are doing so well in that sphere. Now my theory is as follows. Epic fantasy does provide publishing houses with profits, but compared to romantasy like Fourth Wing and cozy fantasy like Legends and Latte, the margins might not be large enough compared to epic fantasy, and therefore publishing houses are shifting their focus to an area where more money can be made, basically. Now I recently met Chris Wooding at Golan's Fest, the author of The Ember Blade and other books, and I actually asked him why he thought that publishing houses weren't interested in publishing epic fantasy at the moment, especially by debut authors. And he wasn't really sure, but he did also say that if someone starts reading epic fantasy at the moment and wants to cover the basics, then it's recommended to read Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, A Song of Ice and Fire, Realm of the Elderlings, Malazan and Cosmere, just to mention a couple. And just trying to read those series will probably take most people almost a whole lifetime, right? So the big challenge here is that a lot of readers will only start to consider reading debut fantasy novels if either because of word of mouth marketing or because they have already gone through this incredible backlog of epic fantasy books that are already out there. And if we're being honest, most of us will never read all the books in our backlog. I thought it was really interesting to hear Patrick Lee mention in his video that at the moment it'll probably take him around 10 years to read all the books on his TBR, and he's already read like 600 fantasy books. But what really worries me is that I don't want epic fantasy to stop evolving. Now what I really loved seeing in the past decade is how fantasy has opened up and become more diverse and varied, and that has happened due to the surge in popularity of fantasy. Now obviously, if interest in fantasy goes down, then it's only natural that the evolution and growth will also start to slow down as well. Moreover, I'm just a huge fantasy nut, and I want more people to discover the beauty of this genre. But as with most things, I think epic fantasy will eventually make a solid return. And while we're waiting for that to happen, there are lots and lots and lots of books in our backlog to go through. Plus, we can always go to the self-publishing community where epic fantasy is seemingly still thriving. Now, if you want to know what the longest epic fantasy series are of all time, then you should definitely check out this video. Oh, you're still here and you want more? Well, the good news is that if you want more and you want to support me, then I do have a Patreon. Now, if you didn't know, then I have a Viking book club where every single month we read one book together, and you can be the one that can put the book forward. Last month we read this book, and this month we're reading this book. And at the moment we are trialing having Zoom book club discussions after everyone has read the book. So also if you want to discuss a book with me and other like-minded people, then the Patreon is the way to go. Now, in addition to getting your name in my videos, joining the Viking book club, potentially getting art cards depending on what tier you are, I am also basically spending around 100% of my Patreon income to reinvest back into my channel. Since I launched my Patreon, I have had more than 30 videos professionally edited. And just to give an example, from September 2023 to March 2024, I have spent more than $1,500 into video editing with the aim to consistently post high quality videos for you to enjoy. It is much appreciated.